The following is a clip on dialectics, Hegel's reasoning, and the idea of knowledge. This is a clip from a lecture given by Benjamin on this channel, so if you want to watch a full lecture, go check it out in the card above. Without further ado, let's get into the video.
And the final shape of spirit is that of absolute knowing. Theoretically, the progression of reason through religion and culture will eventually result in a state of absolute knowing, where everything that has the possibility of being known is known, and everything is actualized. So Hegel argues that to attain this state of absolute knowing, you must know everything there is to know about knowledge. And this isn't just simple epistemology or theory of knowledge, because for a truly complete system of epistemology, you would have to know every single piece of knowledge that exists or has the possibility of existing. And so for Hegel, absolute knowing is knowing everything there is to know about knowing, because for that to be possible, you would know what knowing is, how it functions, and more importantly, what exactly the objects of the knowledge are. And he also calls this when spirit knows of itself as spirit. And the phenomenology of spirit is not the journey of an individual consciousness or a group of conscious beings, but instead is the journey of absolute spirit as it actualizes itself in everything. And as individual self-consciousnesses, we may think that absolute knowing is impossible because it would be like making a perfect map of Hong Kong, but then that map would have to include ourselves making the map as well, thus resulting in a state of infinite regress. And you can look at the picture on the right, which shows maps within maps, which illustrates this quite well. So if you're trying to make a perfectly scaled, perfectly detailed, perfectly accurate map of Hong Kong, you would also have to include yourself making that map. But with yourself making that map, you would have to include the map that is being made. And then within that, another map, and then another map, and then another map. So it's just a state of infinite regress with turtles all the way down. And that's why humans can believe that absolute knowing is impossible. But perhaps that is exactly why absolute is possible, because our denial of the possibility of absolute spirit is just because we are spirits which do not yet know of ourselves as spirit. So we are confined to the frameworks of human reason, but absolute knowing and absolute spirit transcend all of that entirely. And when spirit knows of itself as spirit, when we come to know ourselves as spirit, no longer thinking in terms of individuals or societies, and simply as the absolute spirit, then we will realize that absolute knowing is possible because we will have just attained it. And dialectics and spirit. So we've come to the end of our summary of the phenomenology of spirit, and we'll be talking more about the general ideas of Hegel's philosophy. So Hegel's dialectic is commonly believed to be thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but that is wrong because he never actually used that phrase in both the phenomenology and in the science of logic, which built upon the ideas in the phenomenology and gave a deeper exploration of the idea of dialectics. And the science of logic I'm referring to here isn't the one in Hegel's encyclopedia, but the individual work, the science of logic. And instead, it can be thought of as abstraction, negation, concretion, but even better as something that cannot be schematized and thought of in a linear way, and rather as the movement and progression of spirit through world history. So ultimately, Hegel is a philosopher of history. And another way to think of the dialectic is in terms of being for itself, being in itself, to being for another, and finally to being for itself, which was referenced earlier. So in being in itself, you just have a pure concept, and it's the thing in itself. It's the being that only acknowledges its own existence. And with being for another, the being becomes self-conscious and recognizes the objects around it. And finally, it becomes a being for itself, which is the actualization of its freedom. And being for itself, can be being in itself, being for another, being for itself, can be thought of as both a model for humans and consciousnesses and self-consciousnesses, but also as a model for the movement of ideas. And with the analogy with the abstraction, negation, concretion, that's to do with how an idea begins as purely abstract, then it's negated and exists in a concrete form. But then it's always an infinite cycle because the concrete then moves to become the abstract and then negates itself and then concretes and then abstracts and then negates. And so it just continues forever. And the final stage of this process is called Aufhebung. And Aufhebung is roughly the concretion of the dialectic. And Aufhebung is a German word which translates into English as sublation or sublimation, and is used to describe how dialectics often are used to attain some higher truth. And this higher truth is also called the absolute idea. And the idea that dialectics cannot be thought of in a linear way also linked to how human reason cannot grasp the full extent of dialectics, because dialectics are the movement of everything throughout world history, but we are just humans confined to human logic, and so we cannot fully conceive of the nature of dialectics. And near the end of the book, Hegel finally gives a definition of spirit as either substance which actualizes itself as self-consciousness, or self-consciousness that actualizes itself as substance. And substance here is the Spinozist idea of substance, because Hegel began as a bit of a Spinozist. And so spirit is everything, but condensed within just one thing, or one thing which contains within itself everything. And that is, in short, what spirit is. And Hegel is also sometimes thought of as a philosopher of history and a philosopher of freedom. And we talked about how he's a philosopher of history with the idea of spirit moving throughout world history. But as a philosopher of freedom, Hegel argues that as spirit becomes more and more developed, freedom also becomes more and more developed. Because with the development of identity and through self-consciousness, then humans are able to have more freedom in the construction of their identity and in the construction of societies, of moral laws through reason. And so ultimately, spirit is also the development and enlargement of freedom, and how freedom becomes more and more available. And spirits can then be categorized to subjective spirit, which is just a consciousness, which then moves to objective spirit, the self-consciousness, or rather, how different self-conscious beings interact with one another in a network-like society. And then the collection of all these different spirits throughout world history is the system of absolute spirit. And absolute spirit is just everything there is or can possibly be condensed within a single form. And all of postmodernism can be understood through the lens of the phenomenology of spirit, and lots of postmodern ideas build upon these fundamental Hegelian notions, and this will be more evident in future lectures.